Good morning.
Pacing nervously.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session with James Mayhew. So I'm going to hand over to him pretty quickly. My name is Tiara. Just a little housekeeping to start off with. Please, if you have a question, it's best to ask it in the Ask a Question box so that we can keep everything on track. And you see the Donate to 7 Stories button at the bottom of the page. If you can spare a little, please donate to them. They would be forever grateful. So without further ado, I think everyone on here knows James Mayhew. I've already told him in my household, we're a big fan. The Katie books were one of the first books we got for our son when he was a toddler. Katie in London, Katie and the picture show went with us to London, and my son ran off in the National Gallery looking for the picture. So I am super excited, bit of a fan, not a stalker, just a fan. So James, please.
Thank you very much, Tiara. Okay, so I'm just going to share screen, and then you can see exactly what's going on. There we are. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking obviously about book illustration of the day, and I'm going to start just by explaining why I started doing it. And I began in February 2017, almost 3 years ago. And the reason was that Twitter was such a miserable place. It can still be, but at the time it was all Brexit this and Trump that. And I was very aware of the negativity in my own feed. And I thought, well, instead of just moaning about it, maybe I can just do something positive instead. And at the time I was involved a lot with the Pictures Mean Business campaign, which Sarah McIntyre is spearheading, as I'm sure lots of you are aware. And if you're not, it's really about trying to make sure that illustrators get properly credited, because very often in reviews and in other situations, they're not necessarily given the credit for their work. So I thought, well, maybe there could be a book illustration of the day to try and highlight some of the illustrators that I grew up with and that I remember, but also to discover new people as well. And I found that it suddenly became very popular, and I gathered a huge following, which has been wonderful. Lots of people seem to love looking at these illustrations. It's been a great way of exploring their nostalgia, and it's created a wonderful community of people who I think are passionate about book illustration. So today is really a celebration of all of that. The agenda is really quite simple, just to celebrate book illustration in its many forms. Obviously, I focus on children's books. Occasionally, there are things outside that realm. Now I even get publishers asking me to promote new books, which I'm also happy to do, particularly now with book launches being so difficult. It's nice to celebrate a new book if it's beautifully illustrated. And it's been a reminder to me of just how good a lot of illustration is. The quality is incredible, and how it imprints on our minds and colours our view of the world and stays with us all our lives. A reminder that we all have a duty, I think, to try and find the right books for children, librarians, publishers, teachers, parents. And illustration has often been sneered at in the art world, but I'm very proud of this profession, and I really want to highlight just how fantastic some of the skills and some of the quality of art really is. It's also been a reminder of the role that women have played at a time going back into the first half of the 20th century, when a career for women was not easy. A lot of children's books were both written and or illustrated by women. So for every E.H. Shepard, there's a Lucy Mabel Atwell, and for every Edmund Dulac, there's a Cicely Mary Barker. Fabulous artists, some better remembered than others. Why the diversity is a bigger problem, we'll touch on this in the talk. And then, of course, I had to work out how to organise it. And I thought being chronological wasn't going to work. So I've gone for a seasonal approach, which is very much how I post and choose the illustrations. So let's begin. As it started in February, it was cold and snowy. So the very first book illustration of the day was For Moominland Midwinter by Tove Jansson. So much is written about her writing, not so much about her illustration, I think. And she was a brilliant graphic artist. This is not particularly typical because it's a painting, and actually it's her line work, her black and white work, which is particularly dazzling. And we'll come to that later on. We'll see some of that, see some examples. But this was the very first one. And it's my favourite in the series of Moomin books. I'm still amazed when I visit schools how few children actually read the Moomin books. They might know the characters, they might even have pencil cases or handbags or things with the Moomins on, because they're very widely merchandised now. But very few of them have actually read the books, which is a huge shame, because despite all the Moomin stuff out there, the books are still the real thing. Sticking with winter, this is by an artist called Boris Zvoikin, and he was a Russian illustrator. This is a Russian fairy tale, Sneguruchka, the snow maiden, the daughter of winter and spring, who falls in love and her heart melts, and so she melts as well. Very sad, bittersweet little story. I've got a particular interest in Russian art, so you'll probably see quite a few examples of different Russian artists. So bear with me while you indulge me. A very famous wintry book. I haven't been given dates, I realise. So the last one was 1925 and Tove Jansson was 1957. This is Ezra Jack Keats' Snowy Day from 1962. By the way, I do have a list of all the illustrators that I'm going to be mentioning, and there's a lot, so fasten your safety belts. So if at the end somebody needs to see the list or wants to be reminded of the artists I've mentioned, I'm sure we can make that list available somehow through Twitter or through the Honk Fronts. This was one of the earliest examples of showing a black child in a picture book, all the way back in 1962. Groundbreaking book. Still in print, still popular, still beautiful, wonderful patterns and textures, very typical of the time. A really important book because it really started to open up the conversation about diversity in children's books. Quite often I'll pick a theme for a season. So The Snow Queen, which is a favourite story of mine, Andersen's Snow Queen. There are so many illustrated editions. I slightly collect illustrated editions of the Snow Queen. So I could easily fill a couple of weeks just with different illustrations of the Snow Queen in January, which is what I've been doing. This is by Toma Bogdanovic, a Czechoslovakian illustrator, 1967. Really interesting techniques and patterns and textures there. I really like that one. This is by an illustrator called Lars Boe, 1968. It's a kind of printmaking, a kind of etching. And then this is by our very own Angela Barrett, one of the greatest living illustrators, I think. Again, not as well known as she should be. Sometimes when I post her illustrations for book illustration of the day, people will say they've not even heard of her. Certainly she's not on social media and she's very modest and keeps a low profile, but she is absolutely brilliant. One of my absolute favourite illustrators of all time. And this by another favourite illustrator of mine who sadly died very young, but is still fondly remembered by people who love illustration. This is Errol LeCain, and his version of the Snow Queen is in 1979. He did a lot of fairy tales. He even contributed to a BBC film of the Snow Queen back in the early 70s. Wonderful, wonderful artist. Very decorative sometimes, beautiful work. And this is also from an Andersen fairy tale, but not the Snow Queen. This is Thumbelina. I wonder if you can guess the illustrator. I can't hear you, so I'm going to have to just tell you the answer. It's Shirley Hughes, not very characteristic of her work, but really beautiful. 1962. And I think she's done the line work separately from the watercolor work, which is why it has that sort of dual brilliance to the black line. It's very clear and crisp. From about the same vintage, our Ladybird books, What to See in Winter. This is by Tunnicliffe. We were spoiled in the 60s having artists of the caliber of Tunnicliffe, who was a famous wildlife artist, illustrating really affordable, everyday books like this. Throughout the talk, I'll be touching on some interesting stories. This is a very sad story, actually. I posted this for a winter image because it's a Scandinavian artist, John Bauer. This is for a fairy tale called The Ring by Helena Nyblom from 1915. And the sad story is about the artist. Sadly, he was moving his family to Stockholm, and there had recently been a train crash in Sweden, so they didn't dare go by train. They took a boat across a big lake, and there was a freak storm and the boat sank, and he and his whole family drowned. So he also died very young. Sorry about this. There are some happier stories coming, I promise you. But because of this, his work is very cherished and remembered and loved. And another wonderful winter image. This is from a fabulous series. They were called the Père Castor series of books. They were non-fiction books, and they were illustrated by an artist who called himself Rohan. His real name was Fyodor Rohanovsky, another Russian artist. This is from 1950, Scaff the Seal. And these are all lithographs, which is why they have that particular interesting quality where all the colours have been created as separate layers of art and then printed together. Sometimes I need to escape to somewhere warm in the winter, and where better than the land of the Arabian Nights. This is from one of my all-time favourite books, illustrated by Edmund Dulac. I first discovered this illustration on the cover of an LP of Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade when I was a kid. I fell in love with the illustration and the music, and it took me a long time to track down where the illustration came from. In fact, just last year, my partner in print, Zeb Soanes, who I do the Gaspar books with, gave me a wonderful gift, a very early edition of this book of the Arabian Nights illustrated by Dulac, where this illustration sits. He was a fabulous illustrator, and yeah, this is one of my absolute favourite books in the world. Another Scheherazade. This one is by the Johnson sisters. They were called Janet and Anne, Graham Johnson, I should say, sorry. And this is from 1963. I don't think anybody quite knows who did what, because they worked together on their illustrations, a most unusual partnership. They were more famous perhaps for illustrating the 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith, but this is a really sumptuous, rich edition of the Arabian Nights, which I'm very fond of. And this is by Gustav Tenggren for the Golden Book of the Arabian Nights. Tenggren was an American illustrator who illustrated lots and lots for the Golden Book series, which has been a hugely successful series in America. A few of them came across the pond to Britain, but not all of them. And it's quite hard to track them down, but this is a really, really lovely edition. This is from 1957. And Errol LeCaine again, 1981. This is his version of Aladdin. And Aladdin isn't actually a very authentic story from the Arabian Nights. It was added during a translation, so it's not really one of Scheherazade's true stories, but it's a wonderful story, and of course probably the best known, ironically. Fabulous decorative borders and patterns in LeCaine's work there. This time of the year, in Suffolk, where I live, we often get rain and floods. It's actually not raining today, but we have had terrible floods the last few weeks. So I think at one point during a flood, I posted this. This, of course, is by E.H. Shepard for Winnie the Pooh, 1926, and coloured in 1971, when he was still still alive but quite frail. Went to a wonderful exhibition of his work at the V&A a couple of years ago, and just seeing all these grown-ups looking around with such overwhelming emotion on their faces, to see their childhood brought to life again in frames in this exhibition. It was a beautifully curated exhibition, wonderful. It was E.H. Shepard who was first offered Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers, and he was far too busy to do it, of course, so he turned it down. And the job went to his daughter, Mary Shepard. Not everybody knows that. And she was actually given a fee by the Disney Studios so that they could reference her illustrations when designing for the film, which is not very typical, actually. And the same respect wasn't afforded John Birmingham, who illustrated the original Chitty Chitty Bang Bang by Ian Fleming in 1964. The film was rewritten largely by Roald Dahl, although much of his script was rejected. Imagine rejecting Roald Dahl, incredible. Anyway, it was a bit of a hodgepodge of a script, and same with the design. They completely ignored Birmingham, and he was very hurt. He never, ever saw the film, which was subsequently recreated in many, many books. This is by Gordon Late, a very little known illustrator. He's actually today's book illustration of the day on Twitter. He specialised mostly in fairy tales. He wasn't an obvious candidate to illustrate Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but here's his interpretation, and very much based on the film car and very different to Birmingham's. So I think by now spring has probably sprung. So we're back to Pere Castor. This is again from 1950, and this is Mischief the Squirrel. And the illustrator again is Rochanowski. More squirrels here. Another almost forgotten illustrator, Krystyna Turkska, Polish illustrator. This is Tamara and the Sea Witch from 1971, a Russian tale because she originally grew up in Russia despite being Polish. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. Really interesting work. Fascinating textures, lots of scratched surfaces and things going on in her work. Which I really, really love. Back to Russia, more spring flowers. This is Ivan Bilibin, and this is from the tale of Tsar Zaltan. A fascinating story behind this because it was a story told to him by his nurse, which he then remembered and turned into his famous verse, The Tale of Tsar Zaltan, which inspired an opera by Rimsky-Korsakov, from whence comes The Flight of the Bumblebee, all because of the story from a nurse many, many years earlier. Fabulous things all linking together there. This is the same story, but a different illustrator, an illustrator very much in the style of Bilibin. This is Boris Zvorkin, who we saw at the beginning with the Snow Maiden. And just beautiful, decorative, almost Fabergé-like details to these works, very reminiscent of that sort of whole era, I think, of decorative art in Russia, and reminiscent of Easter, which brings me on to this, which is a beautiful illustration by Leonard Weisgard from 1950, The Funny Bunny Factory, story by Adam Green. Very typical of the era, I think, and very much an influence on today's illustrators. A lot of the shapes and forms we see in 50s illustrations have had a big influence. I think we'll be able to see that as we go through some of these. This is obviously by Adrienne Adams. You can see that because it's the cover, The Easter Bunny That Overslept. I've had great fun discovering illustrators I never knew about. I didn't know Adrienne Adams' work at all. I think she was published in America and perhaps her books didn't make it here. But again, another charming Easter-themed book. And although it looks like it's been done in watercolor, I think it's been done in watercolor in different layers, which is why the printing has a particular vibrancy. Often books in those days were printed in quite a complicated lithographical method, just because that's the way printing worked then. So full color printing was very difficult. And often you'll see images where color is separated, and we'll see examples of that later on. And this is by Mary Blair, who did so much work for Disney. This is from a book called Verses by Miriam Clark Potter, 1953. And I think here, again, you can see the influence today on modern illustration, the shapes and forms and the simplicity and the kind of characterizations as well. This has been very, very influential work. Still beautiful. So this is an example of how I think that kind of world has influenced modern illustrators in a really positive way. This is Benji Davis's fabulous Tad, which was just from 2019, a couple of years ago. Gorgeous, gorgeous, tender book, which I absolutely love. The body language in his characters is just phenomenal. One of the few digital artists that I really love. Eventually, full colour printing became much more possible, and illustrators like John Birmingham took really full use of that. This is from Harquin, The Fox Who Went Down to the Valley, 1967. So colour didn't need to be created in separate layers. You could just paint what you wanted, and Birmingham absolutely did. Very experimental. There's spray, there's scraping, there's scratching, there's even bits of collage going on, all sorts of different layers painted on top. Very, very experimental. And it's hard to imagine that even just a few years before it appeared. Before Bob Birmingham came along, the typical method of illustrating would have been to do the painting and the drawing separately, which is what Ardizzoni did. So the line drawing was done separately to the watercolor and then layered on top in the printing to keep the line and the color clean and crisp. And this is a typical example. Tim Allalone, 1957. I actually think his best work, Ardizzoni's best work, is his black and white work, where there's much more drawing, cross-hatching, creating the textures and tones. This is from The Minnow on the Say by Philippa Pearce in 1955. I think when it comes to black and white chapter books, Ardizzoni has few competitors. He was just genius. Chapter books are something that I have very fond memories of in terms of the illustration as a child. This is by H.R. Miller for E. Nesbit's The Story of the Amulet. This is the very moment that Atlantis is destroyed by what we would today call a tsunami, I suppose. In those days, I think I called them tidal waves. And I was absolutely thrilled and terrified by this illustration. I would go back time and again to look at this particular image and imagine what it must be like to be standing on that balcony, see that great wave rushing towards you. It's quite a simple drawing in a way, and it's not just in black and white, no colour, but it was so vivid to me as a child. So I think black and white art in chapter books can be very, very potent, probably also because by the time we're reading chapter books, we're at an age where we can really look, understand and remember the illustrations. This is another example of a simple color palette. So the colors here, there's only black, green and orange, would all have been painted on separate pieces of paper and then put together in the printing process. This is Harry the Dirty Dog, of course, Margaret Bloy Graham and Jean Zion, 1956. Adorable, and again, huge influence on modern books. That could have been published this year almost. It has something very fresh and modern about it, despite the period in which it was done. End papers have a huge following, I've noticed, and this is another example of 50s art, 1951. This is by Martin and Alice Provenson. This is for A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson. I guess this is the city built of building blocks referenced in one of the poems. Again, all the line has been drawn separately from the paint, which is a way of giving everything that particular quality. It also means that the artists had to design and plan their illustrations really very carefully. They couldn't just throw caution to the wind. So often the graphic design in those times is really, really clever and interesting. Beautiful work by the Provinsons. I love their stuff. Here we are. This is peak 50s and peak spring going into summer now, really, I think. So this is actually called Sun Looks Down. It's a really interesting little sort of non-fiction book, which I love. It's by an artist I'd never heard of before, Abner Graboff. What a great name, 1954. And I think a clear influence on a modern illustrator like this one, which I particularly like, Christian Robinson, Harlem's Little Blackbird. Christian isn't as well known as he should be, I don't think, American illustrator, but he's going to be my book illustration of the day on Thursday when he has a new book published, so look out for that because it's for a really fabulous book. This is from 2012. It's all about a singer, Florence Mills, story by Renee Watson. Beautiful nods to the sort of era in which the story is set in terms of the graphic shapes and colours. Hugely popular, Janet Alberg, Each Beach Pear Plum, probably a perfect picture book in many ways, except I've become increasingly aware of how white everybody is in her books. And that is becoming a problem nowadays because people are having big conversations about not just relying on classics and being prepared to look at new modern things. And that's not to say a book like this shouldn't be enjoyed still, but all her characters are very white, which makes books like this really dazzle because they are very important and very necessary. Julian is a Mermaid. This is by Jessica Love from just a couple of years ago, 2018 to be exact. Beautiful liquid illustrations. Of course, much conversation about the subject matter, about the whole idea of gender and diversity. Very important to have those conversations, but actually, I'm mesmerized by the art on its own terms because it's just beautiful. It's actually really hard to paint in that liquid, free way, in that very simple way, and make it work successfully and actually not mess it up. It's very easy to mess things like that up. So I take my hat off to Jessica Love because these are just beautiful, really well observed figure drawings. If it's summertime, we can talk about holidays. Here's a teacher off on her holidays with her suitcase. And if you look at the shawl, clinging behind is dear old little Mrs. Pepperpot, an illustration by Bjorn Berg, not to be confused with the famous tennis player. And Bjorn Berg did most of the illustrations. They've been re-illustrated recently. Stories, of course, by Alf Preussen. This is the original from 1960. Now, this is a lovely, happy story. Obviously, the Wombles are off on their holidays there, but I've been posting some illustrations and somebody got in touch called Hattie Gordon. And she said, would I be kind enough to consider showing her mother's illustrations for the Wombles? Because she was the original Womble illustrator and she never gets any credit. So this is by Margaret Gordon for Elizabeth Bereford's Wombles to the Rescue in 1974. And again, an example of how artists are very often forgotten, neglected, not credited, and they fall by the side, and that's a real shame. So it's lovely for book illustrations today to be able to find those illustrators, remember them and celebrate them. And Hattie Gordon was just overjoyed to have her mother honoured on Twitter in that way. Another black and white drawing from another possible summer holiday. If I could have a summer holiday of choice, it would probably be to Spain because my partner's Spanish. And his Ferdinand the Bull, Once Upon a Time in Spain, begins the book, by Munro Leaf, illustrated by Robert Lawson. And also a story really about being yourself, a kind of diversity story in a way. It made a huge impression on me as a child. It remains to this day one of my all-time favourite books ever. Just don't ever see the movie. The movie is dreadful. Don't watch it, don't watch it, don't watch it. But the book is a jewel. Another holiday maybe. This is The Sailor Dog. This is by Garth Williams from 1950. Garth Williams, better known for illustrating perhaps The Little House on the Prairie and gorgeous line work, did a lot of black and white work for chapter books, but he did some picture books too, and this is one of them. There's a joyfully bonkers book about a little dog on a boat having all sorts of seafaring adventures. Another boat, but a very different kind of boat. This is from Orlando at the seaside. And this, as some of you might know, is set in a place called Alborough, which is based on Aldborough, which is just up the road from me. And this boat was a real boat. This houseboat actually existed, and Girl Guides used to go and stay in it and go on all sorts of trips. And I only discovered this because of the author, Francesca Amor-Chaloux, who told me this wonderful story, because she had been on the boat. And it was destroyed in the end. It was decided because of health and safety. It wasn't safe to let school trips or people go on board the boat anymore. So they destroyed it, which is heartbreaking, but it's lovely that it's immortalized in this book in this way. And another story about a journey. I don't know if you know this book. This is one of my all-time favorite books ever, and certainly probably my favorite by Maurice Sendak. And this is called Little Laurie Visited Times Square, 1963. And it's just the most brilliant example of sequential image. I'm not going to show you the sequences now because there isn't time, because I've got so many other things to show you, but it is just brilliant. If you need to look at a book that shows how illustration and turning the page can show sequence, if you ever need an example of that for any reason, or if you just want a really, really beautiful jewel of a book, then I highly recommend this book. It's just absolutely wonderful. This is a very little known book in this country. I don't know how successful it was in America either. It's an American book. My father, who was in the Air Force and visited America, brought it back for me. And it's called The Big Cleanup, another huge favorite. Again, separated color, separate line, but a gorgeous story about a boy who's told to clear up his bedroom in the summer holidays. And he can't bear to throw anything away. He keeps everything because it might just be useful. In this instance, a little piece of wood he keeps because he might be able to use it to start building a veranda for the house that he's going to build for his dog, Morris, one day. Amazing how just one little piece of wood expands into this boy's imagination. This is Racy Helps, and it's amazing how popular these illustrations still are. They're really charming. This is Pinny's Holiday, and these sort of books used to be for sale in post offices and things when I was a kid. I used to see them. This is actually from 1970, so this is just the sort of thing I would have seen along with all postcards and boxes of toffee and stuff. It's of its kind, but it has a real charm, and it's been surprisingly popular on Book Illustrations Today, this kind of thing. Incidentally, at the end of this, I'm going to reveal to you, so brace yourselves, the most popular Book Illustrations Today ever, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. This is by the guy who taught me, Gerald Rose. So he was my tutor at Maidstone College of Art, and this is for a book, obviously Jabberwocky, a collection of Lewis Carroll poetry, 1968. Again, using all the facilities that were available to him. So in terms of color printing, everything that was available to him, he didn't have to worry about separating colors and think about careful graphic design. He could just throw everything at the images and create these wonderful, bold and very funky sort of 60s images. This is, again, another little-known artist in this country, Jiří Trnka. He was a Czechoslovakian artist. He specialized in animation, but also did some beautiful book illustrations. This is you'd think it was The Little Mermaid, but actually it's not The Little Mermaid. It's called The Nix of the Mill Pond by Grimm, the brothers Grimm. And a little interesting story. Recently I was chatting to a neighbor, and he knew I was posting book illustrations of the day. He hadn't seen this, but he was saying, oh, I had this book in the 60s and the 70s of fairy tales, really unusual illustrations, and I've never been able to find it. I can't remember the illustrator. And I said, I bet that's Jiří Trnka. Just what he was saying, I just had a feeling it was going to be Jiří Trnka. So I gave him my copy. I've got to get another one now. I'm going to look on eBay. Gorgeous, gorgeous books, gorgeous illustrations, magical, strange, quirky, beautiful, sort of immersive illustrations. Tom's Midnight Garden, one of the great classic books. I don't think the cover has ever been better than the original cover. This is by Susan Einzig, interesting illustrator who escaped from the Holocaust and did the most beautiful black and white line drawings for many, many books, but principally for this. And her cover is just glorious. This is from 1958. Tove Jansson, another interesting story, because I decided when I was young, because I love the Moomins, to get a Finnish pen friend. Her name is Tarja. We're still in touch. And when we finally met, I was growing up, in my 20s, and she came to stay and I was living in Essex at the time, near Saffron Walden, and we decided to go out on our bicycles, we had bicycles, and go and look in a junk shop. So we went into a junk shop, and there I was with my Finnish pen friend, and I found this, one of the original Moomin books. It's a Finnish publication, but written in Swedish, because, as you probably know, Tove Jansson wrote in Swedish, although she was a Finn, because there's a small part of the population that speaks Swedish as a first language in Finland. So the chances of finding that in her presence was just ridiculously low, but there it was, and I obviously bought it. It was £1.75, can you believe it? So there you go, a little gem there. It's actually an annual of the picture strips that she did for the Evening Standard. This is probably the rarest Moomin picture I've ever found, and this was bizarrely, in of all things, the Daily Mail annual for girls in the 1950s, and I bought the annual for other reasons. It had other illustrations in it I liked, and it wasn't until I got it home and looked through it really carefully that I found there was an interview with Tove Jansson, and she had provided these drawings specifically for this article about her in the 50s. And I posted this on Twitter probably a couple of years ago now, and the official Moomin account got in touch and said, "Oh my God, where's that from? We need to see it. We've never seen that illustration before." And they didn't know it existed. They didn't have the originals. They don't know where the originals are. There were 4 or 5 illustrations in the article. So, of course, I sent them the annual, had to track down another one for myself. And I ended up getting a lovely letter from Sophia Jansson, Tove Jansson's niece, to personally thank me for adding this to the Moomin archive in Helsinki. Moomin Summer Madness. Sometimes the best illustrations are where you don't expect to find them. This is glorious. This is the back cover of the first British edition of Moomin Summer Madness. Look at all of that beauty just on a back cover. Incredible. She really was a wonderful, brilliant illustrator. Her line work rather reminds me of this guy. Most extraordinary name, and I can't find anything about him. So if anybody does know anything about him, please let me know. His name is Steel Savage. What a name. You had to go places with a name like that. 1942. This is for Edith Hamilton's book of mythology, which I still maintain is the best book of mythology I've ever read. It's absolutely fantastic. So if anybody's interested in myths, I highly recommend it, especially if it's got these drawings inside. Another version of the Minotaur. This is the Provinsons again. We saw them earlier with the Garden of Verses. This is from a book of mythology. Again, who did what? Alice and Martin working together. I love how the fold of the page, can you see how the fold of the page is the corner of the room? Simple little things like that just make it fabulous. High Summer and Heat and Tension. This is by Jerry Pinkney for Patricia McKissack's Going Someplace Special, 2001, about a little girl on a bus and segregation. And when the whole Black Lives Matter thing happened last year, I felt it was really important to respect that and try and find Black illustrators. And it was actually harder than you think. And that really reminded me of how important it is to consider diversity in books. There are books out there, but they're rather invisible because of our obsession with classics. So we need to find them, we need to raise them up, celebrate them and share them. This is by Kadir Nelson, I Have a Dream, the whole text of Martin Luther King's immortal speech. Also by Kadir Nelson, The Village That Vanished. Look at the grace of that girl as she dips her toe into the water. So perfectly balanced. It's a beautiful drawing. If it's summer, then it's going to be hot, so we need the sunshine. And this is Brian Wildsmith's North Wind and the Sun by La Fontaine. This is from 1964. The Rules of Summer by Sean Tan, 2013. You mustn't step on snails, otherwise you're going to get struck by a tornado, apparently. Quentin Blake and Summer Cornfields. This is my favourite Quentin Blake book from 1968. It's called Patrick, really about the magic of music. Patrick and his magic violin, bringing all this joy and colour into the world. Glorious stuff. Not such a well-remembered artist, Bernadette Watts. I love her work. She should be much more celebrated. Rapunzel, 1975. And this, for me, suggests summer's height with all the flowers and extraordinary patterns and textures that she creates in her work, mostly with the colour pencil. Absolutely beautiful stuff. And another cornfield, but rather more moody and in black and white. This is from The Lady of Shalott by Charles Keeping, extraordinary artist of the 60s. But this is one of his later works, 1986. Jackie Morris. Here we have Libra, bringing us to September. This is from a book called Stories from the Stars by Juliet Burke in 1966. Sorry, not 1966, 1986. One of Jackie's earlier works, but you can still already see the characteristic watercolor skill coming out there. Fascinating book, actually, about the zodiac signs. So sometimes I might just think about the colors of the autumn. This is very autumnal colored, I think. This is Happy Line by Roger de Voisin, hugely popular illustrator on Book Illustration of the Day. Story by Louise Fatio, 1954. Again, the separated colors and the separated line. Really influential work, beautiful work. You can see the influence on somebody like Helen Stevens. This is her book about a lion, How to Hide a Lion, from 2012. And she has tried to capture some of the effect of separated art and lithography and limited palettes in her work very successfully. Beautiful book. I'm a huge fan of her stuff. I think she's wonderful. Sticking with autumn, the Flower Fairies. Again, they're always very, very popular. Cicely Mary Barker, 1900, still so popular today. And it's very easy to sort of think, oh, I've seen those 100 times. And of course you probably have. But actually the drawing and the costumes and the creations of these characters is really quite something. They are very, very special, I think. Another Roger de Voisin. This is a book called The House of Four Seasons. So it's a great book to look at seasons with. And he's obviously an apple harvest. Again, the separated color. Beautiful, beautiful work. And imagine separating all these layers out, how carefully everything has to be planned, where the blobs of red go, where the bits of yellow go, where the green fits and the blue highlights. It's a very particular graphic skill which isn't needed anymore. Pienkowski, autumnal, because if you look carefully, there are grapes on the vines there. Beautiful, beautiful work. This is from The Kingdom Under the Sea, Joan Aiken, 1971. Another piece by Gordon Late, who we met earlier with Chitty Bang Bang, and one other illustration. This is from a lovely book, again not very well known, by Aileen Fisher, Now That Days Are Colder, 1971. It shows autumn slipping into winter, and really beautiful evocation of the changing season. An illustrator who's always been very careful to consider diversity is Jane Ray. This is from Burley Doherty's collection of fairy tales, Cinderella obviously, with a very handsome Moorish looking prince. Beautiful decorative work, just constantly dazzled by her fabulous skills and techniques. I think she's a wonderful illustrator. Sticking with fairy tales and autumn, I'm guessing that the apples might be autumnal apples. So here's the Wicked Queen from Snow White. I think the Ladybird books, as I mentioned earlier with Tunnicliffe, are so imprinted on our memories. Whenever I think of fairy tales, that's probably the image that pops into my head. I was terrified of eating apples for years after reading that book. And another autumnal Snow White by a rather lesser known artist who I wasn't familiar with till I discovered it for this book illustration of the day. Art Seddon is his name, 1955. Very much in the style of Mary Blair and those Disney images. A more modern autumnal book. This is called Goodbye Autumn, Hello Winter by Kenyard Pack, 2017. Such beautiful, delicate watercolors here. And The Provinsons again, a book of fairy tales from the ballet. And this is The Firebird, which I always feel is a very autumnal story too. And autumn still here with this beautiful piece by Pauline Bain, extraordinary illustrator, obviously for the Narnia books, but here for Tolkien. This is for Bilbo's Last Song, which wasn't published until 1990, of course, by Tolkien. And the skill and the detail in her paintings is really quite something. They're just wonderful, wonderful works. So much to look at, so much to follow. You can go on adventures in her illustrations, I think. A rather melancholy autumnal picture. This is from The Secret Garden. This is by Charles Heath Robinson, one of three Heath Robinson brothers, all of them artists and illustrators. We might know the term, oh, it's very Heath Robinson to describe a piece of bizarre machinery. So that was the brother of Charles who did this illustration from Francis Hodges Burnett's beautiful book, 1911. This is Thumbelina, Lisbeth Zwerger from 1988, another extraordinary illustrator. She very rarely does backgrounds. She puts all her attention on the foreground, as you can see here. and they're so free and fresh looking. I bet they're not that free. I bet she has to work very hard to achieve that. The line work in particular, done in ink, very, very skilled. Beautiful, beautiful work. Echoes of Rackham, I think, in her work there. And this is from Baba Yaga, a book by Ernest Small, illustrated by Blair Lent, an illustrator again I wasn't aware of, 1966. This is printmaking and collage, and quite extraordinary illustrations actually in this book. I absolutely love it. They're very, very different and very dramatic and quite unusual. They have a lovely sort of folk art quality about them, which catches my eye. Another real favourite Sendak book, not particularly well known, Lullabies and Night Songs. And this is autumn represented by the windy nights. So this is Stevenson's poem from the Child's Garden of Verses set to music in this beautiful book. It's a very unusual book, collected by Alex Wilder, published in 1965. Quite hard to find, big format book. If you can track it down, I really, really recommend it. It's the most beautiful book and some of Sendak's loveliest drawings, I think. Dear old Frog and Toad. We might get sick as it goes into winter, so here's Toad looking after Frog in his sickbed with a cup of sweet tea, I think. Arnold Lebel, 1970. This was very much an inspiration for Joyce Dunbar's Mouse and Mole books, which I'm illustrating at the moment, which is very happy. Moomin Valley in November, very poignant, a very final Moomin novel. Look at the line work there, the economy of line, the simplicity of it all. Just absolute genius. I mean, I could just talk for an hour just about Tove Jansson and her line work. I'm not going to because I've got other things to show you still. Oh, yes. No, this is the most moving book I've ever bought, I think. I just saw it in a bookshop and picked it up and fell in love with the illustrations and started reading it. And at the end, I was just in floods of tears. Komoko Sakai is the illustrator. Kazumi Yumoto is the author. 2008, The Bear and the Wildcat. It's about a bear mourning a little bird who was his best friend who has died, and had this wildcat with a violin helps him heal. It's the most extraordinary book. Hard to find now, but if you can, it's a really useful book to have if you need to discuss bereavement ever. Let's cheer ourselves up. This is an example of why I love book illustrations today. Elizabeth Lee. Oh, wow. Had this book as a child and still think about it every so often, trying to remember what it was called. Beautiful Blast from the Past. So there we are. My work is done because I've allowed her to rediscover a childhood favourite, which is by John Birmingham, of course, Troubadour, The Mouse Who Wanted to Play a Balalaika, 1964. Fabulous. So we're into winter now, and it's getting close to Christmas. There's a bit of mistletoe. Here we have Bramley Hedge. You can't go far wrong with Bramley Hedge. Everybody loves that, still do. And this is from The Winter Story, 1980. Maybe Panto Season, Peter Pan, with Lucy Mabel Atwell. Another Panto theme, Cinderella, by an artist, again, not very well known, lithographically printed, Benny Montresor, 1965. This is for a version of Cinderella. It's actually based on Rossini's opera, La Cenerentola, which is a slightly different take on the story, beautiful take on the story. He was a famous set designer as well, did lots of sets for operas and things like that. Really unusual work. And Christmas approaches, so here we have to have, obviously, The Night Before Christmas. This is by an artist called Catherine Barnes, this one. So I'm looking at my notes, 1960. And I've got dozens of editions of The Night Before Christmas. And they're all of them lovely, but I particularly liked this one because I just really liked the blanket over Santa's knees. Just thought that looked really, really cozy. I want a blanket like that. And this is from Delwyn Cunningham for Christmas Songs and Stories, 1973. It actually looks a bit earlier to me, but that's the date given in the book. Looks kind of 50s. I like those angular shapes and the sort of simplistic reindeer on the roof, and the way that the night sky has been carefully reduced around the reindeer so that they show up very carefully and skilled piece of graphic design there. So we've been through a whole year of book illustration, a whirlwind tour. I'm exhausted, I'm sure you are too, and I'm very aware that time is ticking on. So I'm now going to show you the most popular book illustration of all to end with, and that is Judith Kerr. Sorry, we've got one more by Shelley Hughes, which I've got about. So I can't forget Shelley Hughes. That's another wintry one. But the most popular one of all was The Tiger Who Came to Tea. There it is. And that got the most likes of any book illustration I've ever posted. So there we are. That is book illustration of the day. Phew, I'm exhausted. I'm going to hand back to everybody who's listening. Hello.
James, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. You couldn't see what was going on in the chat, but the resonance was just from authors, from illustrators, just absolutely amazing. Really, we really enjoyed it. So we do have some questions for you.
Okay.
The first thing is everyone definitely wants a list of the illustrators because
it's all ready to go.
Okay.
We'll the best way of getting it to you later, but it will happen.
Okay, let me pop into the questions really quickly. So the top question is, if you could offer 2 tips and 2 things to avoid as a writer to help the illustrator when at the illustration stage of your book, what would it be?
2 tips. Okay. Well, that's a big question, and it probably requires a long answer, but I'll try and be brief. I think one of the key things is being prepared to leave things out. Leave things out that can be shown in illustrations. You don't need to describe everything. I remember I was illustrating a book of stories from the opera once, and the author had described the Queen of the Night as tall, regal, and dressed all in black, which sounds great as prose. But when you sit down as an illustrator and you think, all in black? Really? All in black? How am I going to do that? Because I wanted to use blues and purples for the Queen of the Night.
Yeah.
And I felt I couldn't because the text said all in black. So it's being mindful of those absolutes, I think, and leaving that sort of ambiguity in the text. If she had said dressed all in shades of night, then you'd have much more flexibility as an illustrator. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I would think about, I mean, obviously publishers will guide you in terms of how many words to leave enough room for the illustrations. That's really important. The other thing I would say is, if you can, once an illustrator starts working on your book, be prepared to make tiny adjustments to the story. It might be simply that the illustrator wants to break a paragraph, so one piece of text goes on to the next page. The illustrator feels a text is completely sacrosanct, that they cannot make any editorial suggestion like that for the good of the book, then you feel quite restricted. So if you're a writer, be prepared to have that dialogue with your illustrator. Be prepared to break a paragraph or make an editorial change that will help them and help the flow of the book.
Excellent. That's brilliant. I'd never heard that before. Okay. So let me go to the next question. Illustrations these days seem to be solely for children's books. Do you think there is scope for teen, YA, and adult books to have illustrations in the future?
Absolutely, 100% yes. If you go back 100 years or more, classics, books like Dickens and things like that, they were illustrated. They had beautiful, usually etchings and things like that in them, prints. So totally, I think all books can benefit from illustration. I think that there are all sorts of different ways and approaches to that. And there are places like the Folio Society who do illustrate, produce illustrated books of classics.
Okay.
Whatever. So yes, absolutely. But I think with young adult particularly, I think, yeah, huge scope. But I think, yeah, that's up to publishers really. Come on, publishers.
Exactly. Come on, because you just don't see it these days.
No. It'd be great for us illustrators to do something else too.
Absolutely. So the next question is, how much creative input do you have when working or choosing your illustrator? I guess from an author's point of view.
That's not happened to me very, very often because most of the things that I've written for specific illustrators. So I've written books, for example, for Jackie Morris, and she's written books for me. So that's a very particular relationship. But there have been occasions where I've submitted texts and the publisher have said, yeah, we don't want you to illustrate it. We want to find somebody else to illustrate it. Okay. And then usually I've had sort of 3 or 4 illustrators samples sent to me to discuss, and then we will, as a conversation, a dialogue, pick one of them. So yes, I'm involved in that as the author, and I think absolutely, if you are an author submitting a text and the publisher allocates an illustrator that you're not 100% happy with, I think really you should say something.
Have that conversation.
Have that conversation, yes.
Yeah, Joe mentions very rightfully that graphic novels have these illustrations that it's a good example of for adults.
Really good example, and I would have loved to have included some. I mean, if you could see the file of illustrations I couldn't squeeze into the talk today, you know, it's just really hard to whittle it down, and it was probably slightly too long as it was. So yeah, there's so many other things I would like to have included, and graphic novels are a great way of including art for young people, but a very particular way of illustrating as well, because obviously you're showing the whole story. And
Absolutely.
you need incredible skills, incredible drawing skills to be able to pull that off, as graphic illustrators do have. I mean, they are wonderful artists, rather neglected, I think. I think people tend to look down on that as a kind of book,
I
really,
think so.
really unfairly, because the quality of art and the level of draftsmanship in those books is phenomenal. But equally, I think it's really nice to have books where you just have a plate illustration every now and again, so that you have something to guide you illustratively without having everything done by illustration. So there's room
Absolutely.
for both.
I just recently read The Sleeper and the Spindle. I was new to it.
Yeah.
I was beautiful. Just a beautiful combination of words and pictures, just drawings.
So
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Sorry. It's a bit longer. Sandra, I hope I get this right. A lot of picture books nowadays have stylized picture people or animals. And when you post realistically or traditionally drawn and painted illustrations, you get so many people reminiscing about the beauty of the older illustrations. Why aren't there more figurative picture books nowadays?
That's a really interesting question. I think you probably have to look at publishers' marketing strategies for the answer to that. Publishers, and this is a horrible generalization, there are great publishers out there doing wonderful things, and I don't want to be rude about publishers, but there are definitely sort of trends, and there are publishers who tend to jump on the bandwagon of those trends, and so everything tends to end up looking a bit homogenized, unfortunately. There is a huge amount of illustration now which is created digitally, and unless those illustrators like Benji Davis are really, really skilled, then that can tend to flatten everything down and simplify images. And it's very easy with digital illustrating to replicate the effects of some of those vintage illustrations we've been looking at, things like the Mary Blair stuff, which do have that kind of appeal. They have those simple characters, those flat shapes, those bold colors, simplified colors sometimes. That's very much a huge influence on a lot of book illustration. Unfortunately, a lot of the book illustrators today don't have Mary Blair's graphic skills, and they don't have that one. So it tends to look a bit lacking. Sometimes I work, not recently, obviously, but in the past I've been into bookshops and seen a stack of books like staff recommendations. And they all look the same. They could all be done by an illustrator. And that frustrates me hugely. And I think that when you see something of real beauty and quality, when you see something like Angela Barrett or Jackie Morris or an illustrator who use traditional tools and can really, really draw, then just stand out. But yeah, it's very interesting when I post book illustration of the day. Certainly, whoever posted that question is right. The ones that seem to be remembered are very often the ones where there is that level of skill, I think, and beautiful depth, illustrations that you can lose yourself in.
Absolutely. It just doesn't look like the mainstream, everything else that's going on. You look at it and you can see that someone appreciated, has this passion and the talent to do their craft. I have to go back to the first question. Lorraine has reminded me. It was also asking what not to do. So let me read the question again. If you could offer two top tips to avoid as a writer to help the illustrator when at the illustration stage of the book.
So I think I touched on one tip of something to avoid, which is to not be absolute, like the Queen of the Night in Black that I mentioned. But I think another thing that I would say not to do is to try to create stories with really elaborate settings. I don't know if Zeb Soanes is watching. I think he signed up because the
Don't see him.
Gaspard's Foxtrot, the next Gaspard book, which I've just finished illustrating. He wrote a scene about this fox going to Hyde Park when there was a concert on, and in the Hyde Park during an open air prom concert, there's a full orchestra on stage, 60-piece orchestra. There's an audience of 4,000 people, and I would say, don't do that. Don't do that. Can you imagine having to illustrate it?
No.
It's a very easy sentence to write. A fox went to Hyde Park and there was an audience of 4,000 people and this orchestra on stage. You can write that really neatly.
Yes.
But you try illustrating that.
Oh, okay. Lorraine, I hope that was answer to your question. Okay, let's see. We have time, I think, for another question. Lorraine writes, my first book, I made a huge error because the story all happened in one location. Okay, good. Um, let's see. Do you have any advice for promoting artwork and creating a following through social media? Which platforms are best to do this? And how can an artist protect their work while trying to reach an audience?
Okay. Well, I think that a lot of people like Instagram. I've been quite slow to get going on Instagram. I have now started putting Book Illustration of the Day on Instagram as well. But I tend to gravitate mostly towards Twitter for all its flaws. And I think that the way that Twitter has been good for me, because I now have almost 15,000 followers. I had about 1,000 when I started doing Book Illustration of the Day. So you can see how it's grown over 3 years. I think it's because I think it's about being generous. I think it's about not just talking about yourself, but talking about your colleagues and your friends in the industry. So I'm celebrating other people's illustration. I'm posting my own. Once in a blue moon, I might post one of mine, but it's not about me. It's about illustration as a whole thing. So be generous, share other people, celebrate other people, and they will share and celebrate you back. What goes around comes around. So I do think that's important. I think that you need to use it regularly, definitely, because if you don't, then people lose interest.
Exactly.
And I think the other thing to say is in terms of protecting your work, I mean, if you're really worried about it, you can put a copyright strip across each image you post if you really wanted to. But I don't. I mean, I think you just have to have a bit of faith and trust, really. I've never had a problem with my work being stolen that I'm aware of. So I think, again, just have a bit of faith and a bit of generosity. If you're doing something that hasn't yet been published, that's top secret, maybe don't post it yet, save it up, or just show a corner of it. Don't give away the whole thing. Once something's published, it's out there anyway, so people can still copy it and share it. So I don't think that's a problem. But if you're developing something new and you're worried about it being pinched, then be cautious if you want to. Copyright strips on, don't share all of it, share bits of it. Be mindful of that. But I personally haven't had a problem.
Okay, thank you. Am I going to try and squeeze in one more small one? We have 4 minutes. How do illustrations in young children's fiction and middle grade fiction differ?
Well, firstly, there's less space. So you have to really read the text and decide which piece you're going to illustrate. And that's quite hard sometimes. It means letting go of a piece of the book that you might love, but just has room to fit it in. Usually it's black and white as well. So that's a particular skill set. But interestingly, it's often these ones which are most remembered. As I hinted earlier, I think that a lot of the illustrations I remember from things like E. Nesbit are very firmly imprinted in the mind. Because you're only showing a few illustrations, those illustrations are going to imprint a lot. They're going to be very powerful. So you need to choose those scenes really carefully and balance them so you've got a sort of variety throughout the length of the whole book. You don't want to keep on illustrating the same character or the same setting. You want to have a variety. But yeah, those illustrations, because there's so few of them, they're going to have a big impact. So choose carefully.
Okay, I'm going to be very naughty. We have 3 minutes. I'm just pushing this as best I can. No, we've already had that one. That one. Come on, Tara. Let's get to one. Aha, this one. Because of today's inclusion considerations, do you have to really consider this now in the fairy animal stories?
Well, I think that'd be a conversation with the publisher. I think they're trying to be quite aware of what's happening in terms of diversity. So they would probably guide you. I think it would be wrong to just try and engineer something in an artificial way. I think it's got to be a sort of genuine want to do something that covers a diversity issue. I think if you're illustrating people, then absolutely you have to be mindful in many respects, because I had a conversation recently on Twitter with some friends about illustrating black characters and whether that's my prerogative as a white man. It probably isn't. And whether if I got offered a text which required black characters exclusively, whether I should step aside. And actually the consensus was yes, probably I should step aside and allow space for black illustrators to come forward, which I completely go with and agree with. But I think when you're doing fairy animals, obviously the colour of skin isn't going to be the diversity issue. But yes, I think you can be mindful of that, but I think it's got to be a natural thing. I think if you squeeze it in as an issue, then it always looks rather forced and weak and insincere. So
Yeah.
I think it's got to come from the heart.
Yeah, Joe writes, incidental representation is a lot better than issue-only representation.
That's much more.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have pushed the limit. Some questions were not answered. Hopefully we can be able to get them answered. Thank you so much, James. This has been a delight. Thank you, audience. You've been wonderful. And just a reminder about 7 Stories. If you can donate, please do. They would hugely appreciate it. And thanks again also for the Golden Egg Social team for setting this all up and enabling this absolutely brilliant weekend.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's been a joy. Thank you, Tira.
Thank you. And there's a replay. If you want to watch it again, tell your friends, come back. Thanks, James.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.